The idea of mastering the air arose long before the invention of airplanes. As early as the 18th century, people began experimenting with hot air balloons when the Montgolfier brothers sent the first aerostat into the sky. But a balloon is uncontrollable. It depends on the wind, and no one could say where it would go. Everything changed in the 19th century when engineers began thinking about a steerable balloon, the airship. By the end of the 19th century, several European countries were actively pursuing this direction. France and Great Britain built their own models, but it was Germany that took the step that defined the future. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin appeared there. He truly believed that giant gas-filled flying machines would change warfare and make his country invincible. Zeppelin was not just a dreamer. He served in the army, observed aerostats in America, and realized that Germany had a chance to create a fundamentally new type of technology. In 1900, the first flight of his airship, the LZ-1, took place. The machine was imperfect, but the idea itself impressed the public and the military. This was not just a balloon, but an elongated frame with engines and a rudder that could be steered. Soon, a veritable Zeppelin-mania began. Support societies formed in Germany, funds were raised, and airships became a symbol of progress. Newspapers wrote that these flying ships would make Kaiser Wilhelm II's army invincible. After all, an airship could climb to altitudes unreachable by guns, fly for many hours without landing, and carry hundreds of kilograms of cargo or bombs. As early as 1909, the first commercial Zeppelin flights appeared. Passengers flew over Germany while the military watched closely. To generals, the airship seemed the ideal weapon. It combined reconnaissance, transport, and bombardment in one. On the eve of the First World War, Germany created a comprehensive program for developing airships. They were being built ever larger, higher flying, and faster. In the Kaiser's general staff plans, Zeppelins were to play the role of strategic aviation, to strike enemy cities and break the morale of the population. It's important to understand that airplanes were still very weak at the time. Wooden, slow, with a tiny range, they barely stayed in the air and could not carry a serious payload. Against this backdrop, the airship looked like a formidable giant of the future, almost a wonder weapon. Other countries also tried to build airships. Britain developed its own rigid airships. France experimented with non-rigid and semi-rigid designs, and Italy used airships to observe armies in Africa. But it was the German Zeppelins that proved the most advanced and numerous. By 1914, when the First World War began, Germany already had an entire fleet of airships, dozens of machines ready for combat. They stood in hangars prepared for takeoff, with trained crews. The Kaiser's staff planned for airships to be the trump card that would quickly break the enemy's resistance. And indeed, in the first months of the war, airships proved a key element of the new strategy. They conducted reconnaissance flights, helped the army locate the enemy, and soon began to be used for bombing. For the first time in human history, war literally became three-dimensional. Strikes were delivered not only from land and sea, but also from the air. For soldiers and civilians, this was a shock. Huge cigar-shaped shadows passing over cities inspired fear. Even when bombs fell inaccurately, the mere fact that the enemy could now arrive from the heavens shattered traditional ideas about warfare. Thus, the birth of military airships was not merely a technical revolution. It was a psychological turning point. the first time humanity realized that the air had become a new arena of battle, with the airship as its symbol. The main difference between Zeppelins and other early 20th century airships lay in their rigid framework. This is what made Count Zeppelin's machines distinctive and gave them several advantages. The frame was a spatial truss made of light metal, aluminum or duralumin. It consisted of rings and longitudinal girders forming a long cylinder resembling a cigar. Inside this frame were separate gas cells, compartments filled with hydrogen. The number of cells could reach dozens, each with its own envelope. Hydrogen provided lift, but made airships extremely vulnerable because it was highly flammable. The alternative gas, helium, was available only in the United States and was practically not used in Europe. Zeppelin dimensions were enormous for their time. By 1914, some models reached 150 to 200 meters in length, with a hull diameter up to 20 meters. Internal volume amounted to tens of thousands of cubic meters of gas. This allowed them to lift several tons of payload, crew, fuel, armament, and bombs. Control was provided by rudders of direction and elevation mounted at the tail. In principle, piloting an airship resembled handling a ship. The crew was housed in a gondola suspended beneath the hull. On larger models, there could be several gondolas. The forward one served as the command car. The aft one housed engines and mechanics stations. The engines were most often gasoline units by Maybach. 3 to 6 motors were typically installed, driving propellers. The maximum speed of an airship was about 80 to 100 kilometers per hour. The main advantage was not speed but endurance. Zeppelins could remain aloft for more than a day and cover distances of thousands of kilometers. A crew numbered from 15 to 30 people, including a captain, officers, helmsmen, mechanics, observers, and machine gunners. Because flights were long, bunks for rest, a small galley, and stores of provisions were provided in the gondola and hull. Airship armament at first was quite simple. Bombs were dropped manually through special hatches, weighing from 50 to 300 kilograms. Later, bomb racks were introduced. For defense, machine guns were installed, usually on the top platform or in side ports. But defensive effectiveness was limited. Against fast fighters, airships were too slow and vulnerable. An important advantage of Zeppelins was their ability to climb to great altitudes, up to 3,000 to 4,000 meters. At such heights, they were practically unreachable for early war anti-aircraft guns. However, the crew suffered from cold and lack of oxygen, as there were no pressurized cabins. By the end of the First World War, Zeppelin designs continued to develop. Length increased to 220 meters, gas volume to 70,000 cubic meters. They became heavier and better armed. Despite these improvements, airplanes were advancing faster, and the airship's advantages gradually disappeared. Zeppelins were an outstanding engineering achievement of their time. Their design combined complexity, scale, and innovation, making them a symbol of early aviation. Although they ultimately proved a dead end in military technology, they were the first to show that the air could be used for strategic warfare. At the beginning of the First World War, Germany possessed the most advanced airship fleet in the world. Dozens of Zeppelins were in service and considered strategic weapons. The German military planned to use them for reconnaissance, support of the army at the front, and bombing enemy territory. In the very first weeks of the war, airships were deployed on combat missions. Their chief advantage, then, was the ability to climb to significant altitudes, remain aloft for many hours, and cover great distances. Airplanes of the time were unreliable and short-ranged, so airships appeared the more powerful tool. The first operations were reconnaissance flights. Zeppelins took off from bases in Germany and Austria-Hungary and headed to the front lines. They watched troop movements, noted artillery positions, and helped adjust fire. Airships were especially effective on the Eastern Front, where battle lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and traditional reconnaissance methods were not always effective. At the same time, airships began to be used for raids on military targets. In August 1914, the first bombings of Belgian cities occupied by the Entente took place. Bombs were dropped manually through hatches, and accuracy was extremely low. Nevertheless, the mere appearance of giant flying machines over cities had a strong psychological effect. In September 1914, Zeppelins attacked Paris for the first time. These were isolated bombs that caused little material damage but provoked deep anxiety among the populace. Parisians faced the threat of air raids for the first time. Subsequently, airships laid the groundwork for what would later be called total war, in which strikes were directed not only at armies, but also at civilian populations. The Germans also actively used Zeppelins to attack England. The first raids on the British Isles began in January 1915. Airships crossed the North Sea and reached the coast. London, Yarmouth, Hull, Norwich, and other cities were bombed. Although the number of bombs dropped was small, the attacks showed that even the British capital was vulnerable. Combat operations revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of airships. On the one hand, they could appear far behind enemy lines, and in the early years of the war, the opposition had almost no means to intercept them. On the other hand, the inaccuracy of bombing and vulnerability to weather severely limited their effectiveness. Logistics deserve special attention. Special hangars, sheds of enormous size, were built to maintain airships. At launch, dozens of men were required to hold the hull with lines and guide it during takeoff and landing. Supporting a single airship was a complex task, requiring well-trained personnel and robust infrastructure. From autumn 1914, airships were employed not only as instruments of intimidation, but as a real tool of strategic warfare. Germany regarded them as weapons capable of striking industrial facilities and command centers in the enemy's rear. The bet was that the moral effect of the raids would outweigh the material damage. Overall, the first combat operations of the Zeppelins demonstrated their potential and simultaneously exposed their shortcomings. They could terrify the population, disrupt communications, and conduct reconnaissance over vast areas. But the accuracy and power of their strikes remained low, and the design itself was too vulnerable to emerging countermeasures. Thus, the initial combat use of airships was an important stage in the development of aerial warfare. For the first time in history, humanity faced systematic raids on cities, changing the very notion of what armed conflict could be. Zeppelins served as harbingers of a new era of strategic aviation, though their own military career proved limited. When the First World War began, Germany quickly realized that airships could be used to pressure not only enemy troops, but also civilian populations. As early as late 1914, the Kaiser's command developed a plan to use Zeppelins for raids on the British Isles. England was Germany's chief naval opponent, and one of the centers of the Entente's war industry, so attacks on British cities had both military and psychological significance. The first raid on English territory took place the night of 19th to 20th January, 1915. Two Zeppelins, L3 and L4, crossed the North Sea and attacked the coastal towns of Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn. Bombs were dropped on residential neighborhoods, killing several civilians. Material damage was minor, but the effect was enormous. For the first time in history, the British felt their country was vulnerable to air attack. Further raids continued through 1915 to 1917. Over this period, Germany carried out more than 50 airship raids on England. London was most frequently targeted, though Norwich, Hull, Sheffield, Dover, and other industrial and port cities were also attacked. A distinctive feature of airship bombings was that they were conducted mainly at night. This reduced the chance of interception and complicated the work of British anti-aircraft gunners. Flying at about 3,000 meters, Zeppelins were hard to reach for most air defenses of the time. However, bombing accuracy was extremely low. Bombs were dropped manually and, because of darkness, cloud cover, or navigational errors, they often fell not on factories or military sites, but on homes and streets. In London, for example, poor neighborhoods on the outskirts often suffered when munitions fell there by accident. This led to civilian casualties and public outrage. The psychological effect of Zeppelin attacks was significant. Until then, the English were accustomed to thinking that their island was protected by the sea and beyond the enemy's reach. Now the threat came from the sky, and neither army nor navy could fully protect the cities. Newspapers called the airships monsters of the air, and people lived in constant fear of night raids. Authorities had to organize night patrols, deploy searchlights, and strengthen anti-aircraft defenses. In military terms, Zeppelins proved of limited effectiveness. German calculations assumed the raids would cause panic, undermine British morale, and force the government to make peace. In reality, the effect was the opposite. Though frightened, the population rallied to resist, and British industry continued to function without major disruption. Meanwhile, Germany suffered significant losses. As air defenses developed, fighters and anti-aircraft guns increasingly shot down Zeppelins. Because they were filled with hydrogen, any hit by an incendiary bullet could turn an airship into a fireball that burned with its crew. One of the most famous cases was the destruction of the airship SL-11 in August 1916 by British pilot William Leaf Robinson. He received the Victoria Cross for this feat, and the victory became symbolic. The myth of the Zeppelin's invincibility was shattered. In 1916, the Germans tried to increase operating altitude to make airships unreachable for anti-aircraft guns. New models climbed to 4,000 to 5,000 meters, but this had the opposite effect. Crews suffered from cold and lack of oxygen, and bombing accuracy worsened further. Many bombs fell in fields or failed to reach cities at all. By 1917, the effectiveness of Zeppelins as strategic weapons had declined sharply. Losses mounted while results remained limited. Gradually, Germany shifted attention to heavy bombers, such as the Gotha and the recent Flugzeug, which proved more reliable for aerial warfare. Nevertheless, airship raids on England became a milestone in military history. For the first time, an island nation faced systematic air attacks, and civilians were at the center of a strategic campaign. These raids showed that future wars would affect not only the front, but also rear cities, and the notion of a safe rear would gradually lose meaning. At the very beginning of the war, tactics for using airships developed spontaneously. They were used as long-endurance, long-range platforms for observation and, whenever possible, bombing. However, with accumulating combat experience, approaches grew more refined and specialized. The evolution of tactics passed through several notable stages. Initially, the main tactical task was strategic and operational reconnaissance. An airship could climb high and remain for hours over the front, relaying information on the disposition of troops, artillery, movements, and concentrations of transport. Observation was conducted visually and with binoculars. Later, maps and signaling methods were used to pass coordinates to artillery batteries. Tactics called for flights along the front lines, holding a convenient altitude, and long-term monitoring of road and rail hubs. For bombing British cities, a night regime was chosen from the outset. This hindered interception and gave airships relative freedom. The tactic of a night raid included navigating by coastal references, landmarks, lighthouses, climbing to 2,000 to 3,000 meters, and covertly approaching the target. Bombs were dropped mainly by hand, hence accuracy was poor. Either industrial districts or transport nodes were chosen, but poor navigation and weather often meant residential areas suffered, which, however, amplified the psychological effect. As the number of machines grew, attempts were made at massed raids, sending several airships as a group to concentrate force and increase bomb load density. Sometimes, operations combined airships and heavy airplanes. Airships went first to draw attention and dilute air defenses, followed by aircraft with more accurate bomb loads. In practice, coordination difficulties and the vulnerability of the vanguard made such operations risky. When the enemy developed anti-aircraft artillery and fighters, the Germans tried to increase operating altitude. New models climbed to 4,000 to 5,000 meters in hopes of becoming unreachable. But altitude worsened navigation, made manual bomb release even less accurate, and severely degraded crew conditions, cold, thin air. The altitude tactic yielded limited benefits and did not become a decisive salvation. Initially, protection was minimal, a few machine guns in ports. As enemy fighters appeared, defensive tactics placed gun positions on the upper hull and in the gondolas, used bits of armor in key spots, and attempted defensive maneuvers, altitude changes, sharp turns. But by nature the airship was slow and predictable. Maneuverability was limited, and the best defense became pre-planned routing, night sorties, and avoiding zones of concentrated air defense. Tactics encompassed more than piloting. Success depended on quality preparation on the ground, large hangars, gas supplies, fuel reserves, trained maintenance personnel, rapid pre-flight preparation, and proper mooring/takeoff technique reduced the risk of incidents at launch and landing, which themselves could be fatal. Technical and tactical innovations appeared. Attempts to suspend observers on long cables for better view, rarely used, radio for communications, limited and unreliable, and use of incendiaries and special bombs to increase targets' flammability. Yet, many novelties ran into practical limits: weight, internal space, and crew safety. By mid to late war, it became obvious that airship-based tactics ran into fundamental limits. hydrogen vulnerability, low maneuverability, and weather dependence. Improving air defenses and the rise of fast, long-range aircraft pushed airships into a supporting role. Long-range reconnaissance, patrols, and rare raids when risk was justified. Command consequently shifted to more maneuverable, accurate means. Heavy airplanes and bombers. Airships combined impressive volume and payload with fundamental weaknesses that ultimately made them ill-suited for prolonged combat use. The chief technical vulnerability was the lifting gas. In the early 20th century, hydrogen was used widely. It is light and provides strong lift, but is extremely flammable. Hits by tracers, incendiary bullets, or fragments could ignite a gas cell and quickly spread fire throughout the volume. Even small punctures sometimes led to loss of lift and catastrophe. Helium was virtually unused in Europe, scarce and expensive, so the ignition risk remained systemic. By shape and size, Zeppelins were easy to spot. Visible at long distances by day, and at night their silhouette drew searchlights. Low maneuverability and large cross-section made an airship an easy target for aircraft and guns. It could not quickly break contact, jink hard, or hide in clouds enough to prevent aiming. Typical speeds on the order of tens of kilometers per hour made them vulnerable to faster, more agile aircraft. Turns and course changes were slow, ship-like. Evasion was severely limited. In combat, once the enemy gained visual contact, the chance of a successful kill was high. The rigid frame, while preserving shape, was complex and vulnerable. Fragments or bullets striking joints could compromise structural integrity. Damage to gas cells, especially multiple in a row, caused uneven loss of lift and loss of control. Moreover, fabric envelopes and internal cells suffered wear and aging. On the battlefield, this reduced reliability. Airships were sensitive to wind, storms, strong turbulence, and precipitation. Crosswinds complicated takeoffs and landings, and a gale could cause damage during mooring. Clouds and fog disrupted navigation, made accurate bombing impossible, and raised the risk of collisions with terrain or ships. In bad weather, an airship practically lost combat value. They required huge hangars, gas supplies, fuel, and trained crews. Hangars and bases were static. Large targets, destroying or capturing them, deprived the fleet of operating capability. Rapid redeployment was difficult, unlike airplanes, which could use small airfields. Long night flights and lack of precise navigation, coordinate transmission was limited, led to misses and loss of direction. Crews grew fatigued on extended missions. Errors increased, affecting both effectiveness and safety. Night flights over the sea increased the risk of disorientation and emergency landings. Catastrophes with heavy losses, a burning ship with its crew, had a strong demoralizing effect not only on personnel, but also on public opinion and military leadership. The cost of building and repairing airships and the reputational damage from their losses reduced willingness to invest in this type of equipment. From the very start of the First World War, it was clear that the struggle for naval supremacy would play a decisive role in the conflict's outcome. Germany and Great Britain had powerful fleets, and blockading sea routes directly affected the supply of armies and economies. In this context, airships found a special use as aerial scouts capable of controlling vast maritime spaces. Their chief advantage was range and endurance. If an airplane of the time could stay aloft only a few hours, an airship could fly for more than a day, slowly patrolling a designated area. For the fleet, this was crucial. It needed timely detection of enemy movements, tracking of merchant convoys, locating submarines, and warning of approaching hostile ships. The Germans used Zeppelins particularly actively for naval reconnaissance in the North and Baltic Seas. These airships rose from coastal bases and headed into the open sea, where their crews observed the movement of the British fleet. From several thousand meters up, a Zeppelin could see tens of kilometers farther than any shipboard lookout. This gave German command the ability to learn of enemy maneuvers in advance and adjust their own squadron's actions. For example, during the 1916 Battle of Jutland, Zeppelins attempted reconnaissance tasks, tracking the British fleet's disposition. Although weather limited their effectiveness then, the principle of employment showed that airships could become the fleet's eyes. Under favorable circumstances, they were to warn German battleships of the enemy's approach and guide them to advantageous positions. The Allies also used airships to patrol sea lanes, though on a smaller scale than Germany. British kite balloons and lighter airships were employed to protect convoys and ports. Their task was to watch for the possible appearance of submarines. Although spotting a periscope or surface sub was difficult, an airship's ability to hover for long periods made it easier to notice subtle traces on the water indicating a U-boat's presence. German submarines posed a serious threat to British shipping, sinking merchant vessels to cut supply lines. Another minus was vulnerability. The huge size made airships easy targets for anti-aircraft guns and aircraft. And hydrogen, as a lifting gas, turned any incendiary hit into a mortal threat. Fire spread through the structure in minutes. Airplanes were much smaller and more maneuverable, which greatly improved their survival odds in combat. Navigation mattered as well. Airships often flew at high altitudes and in poor visibility, reducing bombing accuracy. Airplanes, by contrast, could fly low and attack specific targets precisely. Their strikes were more accurate even with smaller bomb loads. As a result, the effectiveness of airplanes against military targets grew rapidly, while airships became less effective. Psychologically, airships initially made a stronger impression. Their appearance over cities caused panic. A huge hull, the drone of engines, and bombs falling on residential districts left deep marks on people's minds. But over time, the population adapted to such raids, and the advent of bomber aircraft like the German Gothas changed the image of the aerial threat. The airplane became the main instrument of air war. In terms of cost, airships also lost out. Building them required major resources, and operation demanded complex infrastructure. Giant sheds, specialized bases, large maintenance crews. Airplanes could be mass-produced quickly, required fewer materials, and were easier to operate. In a protracted war, mass and low cost became decisive factors. Armament development was also key. Airplanes became more versatile each year. Specialized fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes appeared. Armament improved, first machine guns, then heavier bombs, and synchronizers for firing through the propeller arc. Airships remained essentially what they had been at the start. Modernization was limited to larger size, more gas, and more machine guns. Technological progress favored airplanes. By the end of the war, the comparison's outcome was obvious. Airships retained some value as long-range reconnaissance and maritime patrol craft, but heavy bombers replaced them in strategic aviation. Airplanes proved more flexible, faster, more precise, and more cost-effective. The unfixable vulnerabilities of airships made them symbols of a passing era. Thus, comparing airships and airplanes vividly shows technological competition. In 1914, airships were considered the pinnacle of aviation thought, and airplanes experimental machines. By 1918, the balance had flipped. Airplanes became the backbone of air war, and airships moved to the periphery. This evolution shaped aviation's future for the entire 20th century. The First World War was both the peak of airship employment and the beginning of their end. They proved, for the first time, that the air could be a theater of strategic war. Zeppelins struck cities, conducted reconnaissance, and escorted fleets, showing that the rear was no longer safe. This was a real shock for Europe. Civilians found themselves on the firing line, and the psychological impact of raids outweighed material damage. Technically, airships were an important step forward. A rigid duralumin frame, multi-cell gas system, and the first radio transmissions from aboard all became part of aviation's general progress. Their colossal size and range seemed like the embodiment of the future. They could fly for entire days and carry tons of cargo, making them the strategic bombers of their time. But the war also exposed all the weaknesses of these machines. Airships were slow, huge targets dependent on weather. Hydrogen made them deadly for their own crews. A single incendiary hit could turn a Zeppelin into a fireball. By 1917, it was clear that airplanes were advancing faster and delivering far greater effectiveness at lower cost. After the war, airships continued for a while in passenger service, becoming symbols of the luxury and technological optimism of the 1920s to 1930s. But disasters, especially the destruction of the Hindenburg in 1937, finally shattered public trust.